The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Pentagon's secure briefing room as Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her uniform one final time before entering. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from years of proving herself in a world that hadn't always welcomed her presence. Her blonde hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her blue eyes held the sharp focus of someone who had learned to see details others missed. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as she stepped through the heavy steel door. 12 men sat around the polished mahogany table, their uniforms decorated with ribbons and medals that told stories of battles fought in distant lands. At the head of the table sat Admiral James Hartford, a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. His gray eyes swept over Sarah with what she had come to recognize as the measuring gaze of someone trying to decide if she belonged. Sarah had been summoned to this meeting with less than an hour's notice. Her assistant had burst into her office at the Naval Special Warfare Command with a message that left no room for questions: report to Pentagon Briefing Room Alpha 7 immediately. The urgency in his voice had sent a chill down her spine, but she had learned long ago not to show uncertainty in her expression. Commander Mitchell, Admiral Hartford's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Please, take a seat. She moved to the only empty chair, positioned halfway down the table between two captains whose names she recognized from intelligence briefings. Captain Robert Hayes sat to her left, a man she had worked with during the Afghanistan operations 3 years prior. He offered her a barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. To her right sat Captain Michael Torres, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his skepticism toward women in combat roles. Gentlemen, Admiral Hartford began, his hands folded on the table before him. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. As you're all aware, the intelligence community has been tracking increased activity in the South China Sea. What you don't know is that we've lost contact with one of our deep cover assets. A map appeared on the wall-mounted screen behind the Admiral. Red dots marked various locations across the region, connected by lines that suggested movement patterns. Sarah studied the display with practiced eyes, already beginning to piece together the tactical implications. Agent Phoenix has been dark for 72 hours, Admiral Hartford continued. His last transmission indicated he had obtained critical intelligence regarding a new weapons system being developed in underground facilities. This intelligence could shift the entire balance of power in the region. Captain Hayes leaned forward in his chair. Sir, what type of weapons system are we discussing? Hypersonic missile technology, combined with stealth capabilities we haven't seen before. If this intelligence is accurate, and if it falls into the wrong hands, it could render our entire Pacific Fleet vulnerable. The weight of the statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand why she had been called to this meeting. Her specialty in underwater demolition and covert infiltration made her one of only a handful of officers capable of the type of mission that was about to be discussed. The extraction point is here. Admiral Hartford used a laser pointer to highlight a coastal area. 12 nautical miles from the nearest friendly territory. Intelligence suggests Agent Phoenix is being held in a facility built into the cliffs overlooking the sea. The facility is heavily guarded, and conventional extraction methods have been deemed too risky. Colonel David Park, a Marine officer Sarah recognized from joint training exercises, spoke up. Sir, what about air support? A quick strike team could negative. Admiral Hartford cut him off. The political implications are too severe. This needs to be a ghost operation. No official fingerprints, no trace that we were ever there. If something goes wrong, we need complete deniability. Sarah felt all eyes in the room turn toward her. She had been in similar situations before, where her unique skill set made her the obvious choice for missions others couldn't or wouldn't take. But something about the way the men were looking at her felt different this time. There was an undercurrent of doubt that she hadn't experienced in years. Commander Mitchell, Admiral Hartford's voice drew her attention back to the front of the room. Your record speaks for itself. Successful operations in 4 different theaters, specialized training in underwater infiltration, and a security clearance that puts you among the top 10% of active personnel. This mission appears to be tailor-made for your expertise. Before Sarah could respond, Captain Torres shifted in his chair and cleared his throat.
Admiral, with all due respect, this operation requires precision that leaves no room for error.
The target facility is surrounded by patrol boats, underwater sensors, and automated defense systems. One mistake could not only cost us the asset but could trigger an international incident. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but kept her expression neutral. She had heard variations of this speech too many times to count. Always the same underlying message: the mission was too important to trust to someone like her. Captain Torres raises valid concerns, Admiral Hartford replied carefully.
This is indeed a high-risk operation.
That's exactly my point, sir, Torres continued, his voice gaining confidence. No offense to Commander Mitchell's record, but this isn't the kind of mission where we can afford to take chances.
We need someone with more experience in this specific type of operation.
The room fell silent except for the low hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the streets below. Sarah could feel the tension building around the table as the other officers waited to see how she would respond. She had learned that these moments define not just individual missions, but entire careers. Captain Torres, she said quietly, her voice steady and controlled.
Could you be more specific about what type of experience you feel I'm lacking?
Torres seemed surprised by the directness of her question. He glanced around the table as if looking for support before answering. Well, the underwater approach alone requires someone who has demonstrated mastery of deep water insertion techniques. And the timing has to be perfect. We're talking about a window of less than 20 minutes to get in, locate the asset, and extract without detection.
Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You're referring to operations similar to the one conducted off the coast of Somalia 2 years ago?
Where a team had to infiltrate a terrorist stronghold built into coastal cliffs? That's exactly the type of operation I mean, Torres replied, seeming pleased that she understood the complexity. I led that mission, Sarah said simply. The silence that followed was deafening.
Captain Torres's face went through several shades of red as he realized his mistake.
Several of the other officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while Captain Hayes tried unsuccessfully to hide a smile.
Admiral Hartford cleared his throat.
Commander Mitchell, perhaps you could brief us on the details of that operation, for those who might not be familiar with it. Sarah stood and moved to the display screen. The target was a compound carved into cliffs approximately 40 feet above sea level.
3 hostages were being held in separate locations within the facility.
Intelligence indicated heavy guard presence and multiple escape routes that needed to be blocked simultaneously. She used the laser pointer to trace patterns on the map. The approach was made during a new moon phase, using specialized rebreather equipment to avoid detection by underwater sensors. The insertion point was selected based on tidal patterns and current flow that would provide natural cover while maintaining access to the cliff face. As she spoke, Sarah noticed the expressions around the table beginning to change. The skepticism was being replaced by professional interest and, in some cases, genuine respect. The most challenging aspect, she continued, was the vertical ascent. The cliff face was equipped with motion sensors, so the climb had to be completed in sections, timing each movement with the natural sway of vegetation to mask any unusual readings. Colonel Park leaned forward.
How did you handle the guard rotations? 7 days of surveillance from a support vessel positioned 12 miles offshore.
We identified a 6-minute window during shift changes when the coastal patrol would be out of visual range. The timing had to account for both the patrol schedule and the optimal tide conditions.
And the extraction? Admiral Hartford asked.
All 3 hostages were recovered without casualties. The enemy didn't realize they had been compromised until we were already 20 miles from shore.
The entire operation took 14 minutes from insertion to extraction. The room was completely silent for several long moments.
Sarah returned to her seat, aware that she had just shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting. What had started as a discussion about whether she was qualified for the mission had become a demonstration of why she was the only logical choice. Captain Torres, to his credit, was the first to break the silence.
Commander, I apologize. I wasn't familiar with the full extent of your operational record.
Sarah nodded graciously. No apology necessary, Captain.
Due diligence is important on operations like this. Admiral Hartford stood, signaling that the briefing was moving into its final phase. Commander Mitchell, are you prepared to accept this assignment?
Yes, sir, she replied without hesitation.
Excellent. You'll have 48 hours to prepare.
Captain Hayes will serve as your primary liaison for intelligence and support coordination. The operation is classified at the highest levels. The only people who will know the full details are the individuals in this room. As the meeting began to break up, Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to leave. The weight of what she had just accepted was beginning to settle in. This wasn't just another mission, it was the kind of operation that could define the remainder of her career, one way or another. Captain Hayes approached her as she reached the door.
Sarah, good to see you again. That was impressive in there. Thanks, Rob. I'll need to review the latest intelligence on the target facility. Can you have your team prepare a complete package? Already in the works.
I'll have everything delivered to your office within 2 hours. As Sarah walked through the corridors of the Pentagon, her mind was already racing through the mission parameters. She thought about the equipment she would need, the support team that would have to be assembled, and the 100 different things that could go wrong during an operation of this complexity. But, underneath the professional analysis, she carried the memory of the moment when Captain Torres had questioned her qualifications. It wasn't anger that motivated her now. She had learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford in her line of work. Instead, it was the quiet determination that had carried her through every challenge of her career. She had proven herself countless times in training exercises, combat operations, and classified missions that would never appear in any public record. But she knew that in the eyes of some of her colleagues, she would always have to prove herself again.
The next 48 hours would be crucial.
Not just for the success of the mission, but for everything she had worked to build. As she stepped out into the Virginia sunshine, Sarah Mitchell began planning an operation that would test every skill she had ever learned and every limit she had ever pushed. The stakes were higher than just one missing agent or one piece of intelligence. They were as high as they could possibly be. The submersible cut through the dark Pacific waters like a silent predator, its hull designed to avoid detection by even the most sophisticated sonar systems. Sarah sat in the cramped passenger compartment, reviewing the mission parameters one final time by the dim red light that preserved her night vision. Beside her, the specialized equipment that would make this operation possible was secured in waterproof cases that bore no identifying marks. 43 hours had passed since the Pentagon briefing, and every minute of that time had been spent in preparation. Sarah's team had worked around the clock to analyze satellite imagery, weather patterns, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of what they were up against. The target facility was more heavily defended than initial reports had suggested, but that only meant the intelligence agent Phoenix had obtained was even more valuable. 15 minutes to drop zone, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Sarah checked her watch and began her final equipment verification. The rebreather system that would allow her to approach the target without leaving a bubble trail was functioning perfectly. The waterproof communication device that would maintain contact with the support team was encrypted with codes that changed every 30 seconds. Most importantly, the specialized climbing gear that would get her up the cliff face was tested and ready. The insertion point had been selected after careful analysis of tidal charts, current patterns, and patrol schedules. For exactly 18 minutes, beginning at 0347 hours, there would be a window of opportunity created by the intersection of low tide, patrol rotation, and the natural darkness that came before dawn. Sarah's mind wandered to the conversation she had shared with Captain Hayes 3 hours earlier. They had been reviewing the final intelligence updates when he had asked a question that caught her off guard. "Sarah, do you ever think about the cost of doing this work?" She had looked up from the satellite photos spread across her desk. "What do you mean?" "I mean the personal cost. The relationships that don't happen because of security clearances. The family events you miss because of deployments. The way people look at you when they find out what you really do." It wasn't a question she had expected from Hayes, who had always been focused purely on operational details. But she had seen something in his expression that suggested he was asking for personal reasons. Rob, we all make choices about what's important to us, she had replied carefully. This work matters. The missions we undertake save lives, protect democracy, and maintain the balance that keeps the world from sliding into chaos.
But, what about your life? What about the things you want outside of all this? Sarah had been quiet for a long moment before answering. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to prove that women could excel in roles that had traditionally been closed to us. I wanted to make a difference that went beyond what most people could imagine. Everything else is secondary. Now, sitting in the submersible as it approached the most dangerous mission of her career, Sarah wondered if her answer had been completely honest. There were moments, usually in the quiet hours before dawn, when she couldn't sleep, when she thought about the life she might have had if she had made different choices. She thought about her sister Emma, who lived in Colorado with her husband and 2 children. Emma's biggest worry was whether her daughter would make the soccer team and if her son would pass his algebra test. She attended PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues, lived in a world where the most dangerous thing she encountered was bad traffic on the way to work. Sarah had visited Emma's family 6 months ago, during one of her rare periods of leave. She had sat in the backyard while her niece and nephew played on a swing set, watching them laugh and argue with the carefree abandon that came from feeling completely safe in their world. Aunt Sarah, her nephew had asked, "What do you do in the Navy?"
The question had frozen her for a moment. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that you spend your time in places where people are trying to kill you? How do you describe missions that can't be acknowledged and operations that never officially happened? I help keep people safe, she had answered finally.
Like a police officer? Something like that.
Emma had caught her eye over the children's heads and smiled sadly. They both understood that Sarah's work created a barrier between her and the normal world that could never be completely bridged.
5 minutes to drop, the pilot announced.
Sarah shook off the memories and focused on the present. In 5 minutes, she would be in the water, beginning a mission that could go wrong in dozens of different ways.
Agent Phoenix was depending on her.
The intelligence he carried could prevent a conflict that might cost thousands of lives. But, even as she ran through her mental checklist one final time, Sarah couldn't completely push away the question Hayes had asked. What was the cost of the choices she had made? And, when the mission was over, when she returned to her empty apartment and her solitary life, would it all still seem worth it? The submersible shuddered slightly as it came to a stop. Through the small porthole, Sarah could see the faint outline of the cliffs rising from the sea like ancient guardians. Somewhere in those rocks, Agent Phoenix was waiting for rescue, probably wondering if anyone was coming for him.
We're at the drop point, the pilot announced. Conditions are optimal.
Current is running at 2 knots from the southwest, visibility is approximately 30 feet, water temperature is 68 degrees. Sarah moved to the exit chamber and began the final preparation ritual. The dry suit would protect her from the cold water during the approach. The weight belt was carefully calculated to provide neutral buoyancy during the climb. The knife strapped to her thigh was sharp enough to cut through rope or, if necessary, to defend herself in close combat. As she pulled on her fins, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of the chamber wall. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the person who had sat in Emma's backyard just 6 months ago.
This was Commander Sarah Mitchell in her element, prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead.
The chamber filled with water as she activated the flooding sequence. The cold Pacific rushed in around her, bringing with it the familiar sensation of entering another world. As the external hatch opened, Sarah checked her compass bearing and began swimming toward the cliffs.
The underwater approach took 40 minutes, every stroke measured and deliberate. She stayed 30 feet below the surface to avoid detection by patrol boats, using the rocky bottom for navigation reference.
The rebreather system worked flawlessly, leaving no trace of her passage through the water. As she drew closer to the target, Sarah could make out the artificial lights that marked the facility's position. Intelligence reports had indicated that the complex was built into a natural cave system, expanded and reinforced to create a hidden fortress. Getting inside would require climbing 60 feet of sheer rock face while avoiding detection by guards who were trained to watch for exactly this type of infiltration. Sarah found the predetermined insertion point and surfaced carefully, keeping only her eyes above water while she studied the cliff face. The route she had planned from satellite imagery was still viable, but she could see new challenges that hadn't been apparent in the photos. A guard tower had been added since the last intelligence update, positioned to cover the eastern approach route. The guards inside appeared alert and professional, scanning the water with night vision equipment. Sarah would have to time her climb to coincide with their observation pattern, using shadows and rock formations to mask her movement. She floated silently for 10 minutes, watching the guards and timing their routine. Every 3 minutes and 40 seconds, they would complete a sweep and turn their attention to a different section of coastline. That gave her exactly 3.5 minutes to cover each section of the climb. Sarah secured her swimming gear to an underwater cache point and began the ascent. The rock was cold and wet, requiring perfect technique to maintain her grip while moving upward without noise. Each handhold had to be tested before committing her full weight, each footstep placed with surgical precision. 15 feet up the cliff face, she encountered the first unexpected challenge. A section of rock that had appeared solid in the satellite imagery had been weakened by recent storms. As her hand found the hold, she felt the stone shift under her fingers. For a terrifying moment, Sarah hung suspended by one hand while her feet searched for new purchase on the slippery rock. A single piece of loose stone tumbled past her, and she held her breath waiting to see if the guards would notice. But the sound was masked by the waves below, and she was able to find a new route that took her around the unstable section. 20 feet. 30 feet. 40 feet. Each section of the climb brought new challenges and new opportunities for disaster. But Sarah's years of training and experience had prepared her for exactly this type of obstacle. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to find handholds where others saw only smooth stone. At 50 feet, she paused to check her position and timing. The guard rotation was proceeding exactly as observed, giving her the predictable window she needed to complete the final section. But, as she prepared to continue, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. A new patrol boat was approaching from the south, its searchlight cutting through the darkness as it swept the coastline. The boat hadn't been part of the intelligence package, which meant either the enemy had changed their patrol pattern or they suspected something was happening. Sarah pressed herself against the rock face and tried to calculate her options. She was too exposed to retreat back down the cliff, but the patrol boat would reach her position in less than 2 minutes. If its searchlight found her, the mission would be over before it had truly begun. The boat drew closer, its engine noise growing louder as it approached. Sarah could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize, but the tone suggested urgency. They were looking for something specific, and their search pattern indicated they might have detected the submersible's approach. With nowhere else to go, Sarah looked up and spotted a narrow ledge about 8 feet above her current position. It would provide minimal cover, but it was her only option. She began climbing with desperate speed, racing against time as the patrol boat's searchlight began to illuminate the lower sections of the cliff. She reached the ledge just as the boat rounded the point and brought her section of cliff into view. Pressing herself as flat as possible against the rock, Sarah held her breath and waited as the searchlight swept across the stone just inches from her position. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the boat remained stationary while its crew examined the cliff face. Sarah could hear them talking, their voices carrying across the water with frightening clarity. Then, apparently satisfied that nothing was there, they moved on to continue their patrol. Sarah waited another 5 minutes to be certain they were gone before continuing her climb. The final section proved to be the most difficult, requiring her to traverse horizontally across a section of overhanging rock while maintaining her grip on holds that were barely large enough for her fingertips. But, finally, after an hour and 20 minutes of climbing, she reached the top of the cliff and pulled herself over the edge into the facility's perimeter. Phase 1 of the mission was complete, but the most dangerous part was just beginning. Agent Phoenix was somewhere in the complex ahead of her, and Sarah had exactly 12 hours before her extraction window opened. 12 hours to infiltrate a heavily guarded facility, locate and rescue a trained intelligence operative, and escape without triggering an international incident. As she caught her breath and prepared to move deeper into enemy territory, Sarah thought once more about the question Hayes had asked.
What was the cost of the life she had chosen? Looking out over the dark ocean from which she had just emerged, Sarah realized that for her, there was no choice at all. This was who she was, and this was what she did. Everything else would have to wait. The interior of the facility was a maze of concrete tunnels and steel doors that spoke to serious construction and military planning. Sarah moved through the shadows like a ghost, her training taking over as she navigated toward what intelligence suggested was the detention area. Every step was calculated, every movement timed to avoid the security cameras that swept the corridors in predetermined patterns. She had been inside the complex for 2 hours, gathering intelligence about the layout while searching for any sign of Agent Phoenix. The facility was larger than expected, carved deep into the rock with multiple levels that suggested this was more than just a temporary holding site. This was a permanent installation, built for long-term operations. Through her earpiece, Sarah received periodic updates from the support team monitoring from their position 12 miles offshore. The patrol boats continued their regular patterns, unaware that their perimeter had been breached. But she knew that discovery was always just one mistake away, and the weight of that knowledge made every decision critical. "Control, this is Nightshade," she whispered into her throat microphone, using the call sign assigned for this operation. "I've located what appears to be the detention level. Moving to investigate." "Copy, Nightshade. Be advised, satellite imagery shows increased vehicle traffic approaching your location. Estimate 4 vehicles, arrival in approximately 20 minutes." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Additional personnel meant either a routine shift change or something had triggered heightened security. Either way, it complicated her timeline significantly. She needed to find Agent Phoenix and begin extraction procedures before the facility's population doubled. The detention level was accessed through a heavy steel door that required both a keycard and biometric scanner. Sarah had prepared for this obstacle by studying the guard rotations and identifying a security officer who made regular patrols through this section. She positioned herself in an alcove and waited for his next pass. Sergeant Chenway appeared exactly on schedule, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls as he approached the detention level checkpoint. Sarah waited until he was reaching for the scanner before moving silently from the shadows behind him. The takedown was swift and silent. Chen was unconscious before he understood what was happening, and Sarah caught his falling body before it could hit the floor. She dragged him into the alcove and quickly stripped his keycard and checked his weapon. The man would have a headache when he woke up, but no permanent damage. Using Chen's credentials, Sarah accessed the detention level and found herself in another corridor lined with reinforced doors. Each door had a small window that allowed observation of the interior, and she moved quickly from cell to cell, searching for Agent Phoenix. The third cell contained a figure that matched the description from Phoenix's file. David Park, though that wasn't his real name, was a 42-year-old intelligence operative who had been working undercover in the region for 18 months. He sat on a metal bench with his back against the wall, his face showing the effects of interrogation but his eyes still alert and defiant. Sarah tapped quietly on the reinforced glass to get his attention. When he looked up, she made the recognition signal they had briefed during mission planning. Phoenix responded with the correct countersignal, confirming his identity. The cell door was electronically controlled from a central security station, but Sarah had come prepared for this contingency. The electronic lockpick she carried could bypass most standard security systems, though it would take time she wasn't sure she had. As she worked on the lock, Sarah heard the sound of vehicles arriving in the compound above. The additional personnel were arriving ahead of schedule, which meant her extraction window was narrowing rapidly. She forced herself to maintain steady focus on the delicate work of manipulating the lock's electronic components. Almost there, she whispered to Phoenix through the door. "Be ready to move quickly." The lock disengaged with a soft click, and Sarah pulled the door open. Phoenix rose immediately, showing the kind of readiness that came from years of experience in dangerous situations. "Commander Mitchell, I presume," he said quietly. "I was beginning to think no one was coming." "We never leave anyone behind," Sarah replied. "What's your physical condition? Can you handle a 60-foot cliff descent?" Phoenix flexed his hands and rolled his shoulders, testing his range of motion.
They worked me over pretty good, but nothing's broken.
I can make the climb. Good. We have approximately 15 minutes before the next guard check. After that, they'll discover you're missing and the entire facility will be locked down.
As they moved toward the exit, Phoenix grabbed her arm. Commander, you need to know why they were so interested in keeping me alive.
The intelligence I gathered, it's worse than what was described in your briefing. Sarah paused, recognizing the urgency in his voice. What did you find? The weapons system they're developing isn't just hypersonic missiles. They've created a delivery system that can deploy multiple warheads simultaneously, each capable of independent targeting.
And they're not planning to sell this technology, they're planning to use it.
The implications hit Sarah immediately.
A first strike capability of that magnitude could destabilize the entire region and potentially trigger a global conflict. The intelligence Phoenix carried wasn't just valuable, it was critical to preventing a war that could cost millions of lives.
When? She asked. The test firing is scheduled for 72 hours from now. If it's successful, they move to full production within 6 months.
Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was no longer just a rescue mission, it was a race against time to prevent a catastrophe. She activated her throat microphone to contact the support team.
Control, this is Nightshade. Package is secure and we're beginning extraction.
Be advised, the intelligence indicates time-critical implications.
We need immediate priority handling upon return. Copy, Nightshade. Understood. What's your estimated time to extraction point?
Sarah calculated the route back through the facility, the climb down the cliff face, and the swim to the pickup point.
45 minutes if everything goes according to plan.
Nightshade, be advised that patrol patterns have changed since your insertion. 3 additional boats have joined the search pattern, and they appear to be conducting systematic sweeps. The news wasn't unexpected, but it meant their escape route was compromised. Sarah would have to adapt the extraction plan in real time, finding a way to avoid detection while getting Phoenix safely off the island. They reached the facility's main level and Sarah held Phoenix back while she scouted the route to the cliff access point. The increased security presence was immediately apparent. Guards who hadn't been there during her insertion were now positioned at key choke points throughout the complex.
We're going to have to go through the maintenance tunnels, Sarah whispered to Phoenix.
It'll take longer, but it's our only chance of avoiding detection. The maintenance access was located behind a utility room that required crossing an open courtyard. Sarah waited for the overhead lights to complete their rotation before sprinting across the exposed ground, with Phoenix following close behind. As they reached the cover of the utility building, Sarah heard voices approaching from their left. 2 guards were making an unscheduled patrol, their conversation indicating they were looking for something specific. Sarah and Phoenix pressed themselves against the building wall as the guards passed within 10 feet of their position. One of the guards stopped and seemed to study the area where they were hidden, but, after a tense 30 seconds, he continued on without investigating further. The maintenance tunnels were cramped and dark, forcing them to move in single file through passages barely wide enough for their shoulders. Sarah led the way using a small red-filtered flashlight that provided minimal visibility while preserving their night vision.
20 minutes of crawling through the tunnels brought them to an exit point that opened onto the cliff face 50 feet south of their planned route. It wasn't ideal, but it would get them out of the facility undetected. Sarah emerged first and immediately scanned the area for threats. The additional patrol boats were visible in the distance, their searchlights creating overlapping patterns that covered most of the coastal waters. Getting to the extraction point undetected would require careful timing and probably some luck. Phoenix joined her at the cliff edge and looked down at the dark water below. That's a long way down. You mentioned you could handle it, Sarah reminded him. I can. Just making an observation. Sarah began setting up the rappelling equipment that would get them safely to the water. The ropes were designed to dissolve in seawater within 30 minutes, leaving no trace of their escape route. As she worked, Phoenix provided additional details about the intelligence he had gathered. The weapons facility was part of a larger network of installations spread across the region.
The technology they were developing represented a quantum leap in military capability, and the political leadership was prepared to use it to reshape the balance of power. "The test firing location is here," Phoenix said, pointing to a position on Sarah's waterproof map. "It's designed to demonstrate the system's capability to potential adversaries. They want the world to know what they have." Sarah studied the coordinates and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The test site was positioned to threaten multiple Allied territories simultaneously. If the test was successful, it would be a clear message that the regional balance had shifted permanently. "We need to get this information to command immediately," she said. "There might still be time to prevent the test." The rappelling setup was complete, and Sarah prepared to begin the descent. But, as she checked her equipment one final time, the sound of shouting erupted from the facility behind them. "They've discovered the guard I neutralized," she said grimly. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they realize you're missing." Sarah went first, controlling her descent carefully to avoid making noise that might attract attention. The rope was slick with spray from the waves below, and she had to maintain perfect grip while moving quickly enough to stay ahead of the security response. Phoenix followed, and, despite his earlier treatment at the hands of his captors, he managed the descent with the skill of someone who had done this type of thing before. They reached the water just as searchlights began illuminating the cliff face above them. "This way," Sarah said, leading Phoenix toward a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide cover while they swam toward the extraction point. But, as they entered the water, Sarah realized their troubles were just beginning. The patrol boats had closed their search pattern, and the extraction point was now under direct observation. Getting out of the area would require running a gauntlet of searchlights and, potentially, hostile fire. As they treaded water behind the rocks, Sarah contacted the support team to advise them of the situation. The response was immediate and unwelcome. "Nightshade, extraction point is compromised. Recommend you proceed to alternate location Alpha 7. Sarah checked her map and felt her heart sink. Alternate location Alpha 7 was 3 miles further south, requiring a swim that would test even her capabilities in open ocean at night. For Phoenix, in his current condition, it might be impossible. "Understood, Control. Beginning movement to Alpha 7. As they began the longest and most dangerous part of their escape, Sarah thought about the intelligence they carried and the catastrophic consequences if they failed to deliver it. Phoenix had risked his life to gather information that could prevent a war, and now it was her responsibility to get him safely home. The dark water stretched ahead of them like an endless void, and somewhere in that darkness lay their only hope of survival. The Pacific Ocean had turned hostile, with swells that rose 8 feet and cross-currents that threatened to separate Sarah and Phoenix with every stroke. They had been swimming for 90 minutes, fighting against conditions that would challenge even the most experienced ocean swimmers. Phoenix's breathing had become labored 20 minutes ago, but he continued to match Sarah's pace with the determination of someone who understood that stopping meant death. "How much further?" Phoenix gasped during a brief rest between wave sets. Sarah checked her waterproof GPS unit and felt her